All right. So before we dive into the guide, I wanted to start with telling you, who we are as an organization. Code for America is a civil tech organization that partners with government at all levels across the country to build digital tools, change programs and policies. We do this work by using human-centered technology to improve public service with the goal of making sure government works well for all of us. Next slide, Bree. The Clear My Record team here at Code for America, which David and I both work for, we collaborate closely with the Clean Slate initiative to support advocates in successfully passing and implementing automatic record clearance policies. Next slide. Our work is really rooted in this idea that making automatic record clearance a routine government service is the most effective way to removing barriers caused by the criminal record. Next slide, please. And then I'll toss it over to Alex to talk a little about the Clean Slate initiative.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be here with us today. My name is Alex Williams. I'm Chief of Staff at the Clean Slate Initiative. For those who don't know about the Clean Slate Initiative yet, we are a bipartisan national organization working across the country to support state-based organizations and lawmakers interested in passing and implementing clean slate legislation. We're really fortunate to partner with Code for America, among others, but really with Code for America on the technical elements of preparing states for implementation, which they will dive into today. Since the first Clean Slate law was passed in 2018 in Pennsylvania, we've been excited to see 11 more states pass what we consider Clean Slate legislation, paving the way for an estimated 15 million people to be eligible for a partially or fully sealed record. Implementation is a critical part of ensuring those millions of people and hopefully millions more actually receive relief. So when we talk about implementation, it's about process and policy and technology, but really at the end of the day, it's also about people, making sure that people receive a relief from this policy. And our work on implementation is led by our new implementation director, Katie Sabota-Kindle, who's on the line. If you want to just give a quick wave, Katie, if you're out there.
Here I am. Hi, Alex.
Awesome. Katie joins us from her previous role at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, where she was instrumental in implementation efforts in that state. So as Candace mentioned, CSI and Code for America partner really closely, and they have been a great partner to us from the start of our work on Clean Slate. I'll end with sharing that, our ultimate vision at CSI is that people will no longer be defined by their records and will have the opportunity to contribute to their community, have a fair opportunity to work, to get an education, and achieve their full potential. And implementation is a really critical part of that. So we're excited about this resource and this conversation. And to that end, and to ground our conversation today, we wanted to play our new PSA video quickly just to remind us all kind of what this work is focused on and who we're working with and for. And after that, Code for America will kind of take it from here through the presentation. So thank you all again for being here.
What is this?
Oh, that's certificates, things that mommy did.
January 3rd, 2007, my son was born. I laid him on my chest and I put my face down to his head. I instinctively, I knew he was mine.
I haven't seen this in so long.
This is funny. I was your age in this picture. 14. Yes.
This right here is a picture of my 18th birthday. It makes me crack up every time I see it.
Oh my God.
Oh God, I don't even know
You
if
read
I could.
that to me.
A lot of these letters is letters that I wrote to my son. He was 4 or 5 years old at the time.
that I was away when I was incarcerated. I said, "You look so handsome, like a little man."
I wish you could see what I see. You are beautiful, gorgeous, and amazing.
Remember that? Well, this was that day.
It's my first passport as an adult.
Adoption paper.
Oh, wow.
One of the many cards from my daughter.
A little keepsake that I hold on to.
Yeah, you was the old chip off the old block.
It's like looking in a mirror.
The bad records, they follow you for a long time, and it really can affect your living situation, your economic situations, and even your relationships.
It's one of the reasons why I lost custody of my son.
I applied to 5 universities who denied me. My alma mater for my master's in social work denied me because I had a felony.
No one would hire me. Everywhere I went, they were pulling up my record.
When I did get a job, I got a raise after 30 days, and on my 45th day, they called me and said I was terminated due to a background check. So I created my own business.
This was at my reentry awards where I was awarded for Professional of the Year and Personal Achievement in Reentry.
This was a certificate of graduation that I did in Florida while my son was in college.
This is actually my official LLC document.
Now I'm going for my PhD. It's almost like I'm trying to chase getting rid of my record by all these accomplishments. And I think you said that to me. You said you don't need to prove anything to
You don't
anybody.
need to prove anything.
What record are you most proud of?
My master's degree in criminal justice. You know what? Because I'm not a criminal. I'm so much more than my criminal record. These records are me now.
The record that I'm most proud of is my kids, my babies.
I think it's this one right here. That one. This picture represents hope, second chances, resilience, and character. And a chance for me to be the dad that my son deserves.
Oh, I love that video. I always got to make sure not to tear up whenever I see it. Um, like Alex said, I think that's a really great reminder of why we're all here doing this work. And the one of the key pieces to make sure that people aren't defined by their records is making sure that when people are eligible, that they get sealed automatically, and outdated paperwork, expensive, time-intensive, laborious processes don't get in the way of that. So today we have an agenda about a new resource called the Advocate's Guide to Automatic Record Clearance. And this is a new resource that's intended to help people design policies that can get to that outcome, where automatic record clearance becomes, like Candace said, a routine government service, so that when someone is eligible, it happens without any need for them to take further action. So on the agenda for today, we're going to go first into a high-level overview of what is this thing we're talking about, the Advocate's Guide to Automatic Record Clearance. Then we'll go into a deeper dive on the core sections of the guide. And then we'll go through a couple scenarios of how to use the guide in practice, some different use cases that advocates might find this resource helpful. And then we'll round out with a discussion of how Code for America and the Clean Slate Initiative collaborate to support advocates in developing policies that are technically feasible. And then with the remaining time at the end, we'll leave space for Q&A. So folks could, if have questions along the way, make sure to drop them in the chat or hold them until the end. Next slide, please. By the end of the presentation, we have two goals here. We want everyone to come away with this understanding what resources are included in the guide, and how you can use those resources to craft implementable clean slate policies. We won't cover all the information in the guide, that's what it's there for, but we want to make sure everyone understands what's in it and how you can use it. So first up on our agenda, what is the Advocate Guide? Like I said, this is a new resource we've put together. Code for America has been involved in automatic record clearance policy and implementation support for more than 5 years now, and we've worked in more than 20 states at this point. So we've tried to take all of the information we've learned working with advocates, working on policy, working with government, and distill it into a guide that presents foundational info for people so that we're all on the same level and understanding the same systems involved. And then how do you build on top of that to make sure that that information is getting put into policies so that government can actually implement it. And that's the key idea here. We call this technical feasibility, and I'll go into it a little bit more in a moment, but the idea is that this guide is a resource that advocates can use to help create policies that are based on the systems and data and government aspects that are all needed to make sure that Clean Slate can actually happen. This idea of technical feasibility, it might not be a commonly used phrase. It's kind of our mantra at Code for America and the Clean Slate Initiative. So to define it a little bit more, it really means a policy is technically feasible when it's written so that it takes into account the data and infrastructure and resources of the government agencies that are going to need to implement it. The policy takes into account all of those things. And specifically, that means, for the eligibility rules, like which records are eligible for automatic record clearance, making sure that those things align with data that the government agencies actually have. It means eliminating manual steps. With a lot of the traditional petition-based process, there's a lot of paperwork shuffling around, a lot of people calling each other up and emails getting sent. So as much as you can, removing those kind of steps. And then streamlining the amount of back and forth between different agencies so that when the data is flowing across them, it flows efficiently and there aren't a bunch of roadblocks and bottlenecks. One last point on technical feasibility is that when you ensure that your policies are as technically feasible as they can be, it helps them pass, which is important up on the front end, because if agencies believe that they can actually implement them, then they're less likely to push back on them or raise concerns. And then two, it's really important for a policy to be technically feasible so that it can be implemented, because that prevents delays and prevents the odds that there could be repealed momentum or damaging trust in the movement. If you have a policy that just can't be implemented and delay drags on, it could lead to really bad outcomes. So I've talked a lot so far about what is in the guide, and we'll go into that in more detail in a sec. And I've talked about technical feasibility, but as a point of clarification, the guide is not about political and legislative strategy. It's not a playbook for how to get a bill passed. It's about how to write a bill that takes into account all of those factors that increase technical feasibility. There's, I'm sure, plenty of expertise on this call from advocates all over the country, and the Clean Slate Initiative campaign strategy team has even more expertise that they can bring to campaigns about how to get a bill through and develop sponsors and build coalitions and all that stuff. And so there's plenty of expertise to go around on that. The guide itself zeroes in on that technical feasibility aspect.
Hey, thank you, David, for setting the stage for us. So, like David said, today we really want to give you a preview of some of the core sections that you'll be able to find in the guide. You can go to the next slide, please. So a little overview. The way that we organize the Advocates Guide is by breaking the information up in like three main components of information. The first being some foundational information about art. For some of you guys that are new to this space, we know there may be several terms, some that we even mentioned so far in this call that you may not know. And so in that section, we really dive into giving you some detailed information about some of these core concepts that we're talking about. In the next session of the work, we really dive into, how does automatic record clearance actually work? What is the process? We break down what it actually looks like in practice. And then the last bucket of the content, which is probably the most important that's in this guide, is really the technical best practices that we've developed over our years in this work. We really wanted to create this content to give you some guidance on how you can actually craft your policies to be more technically feasible. So in this section, we give you some expert tips on designing eligibility criteria and also creating a process that our agencies or the agencies that are in your states can actually do. Next slide. Okay. So in that first area, like I said, we first talk about some of the foundational knowledge that you might need to know before you actually start designing your policies. We know it's a lot of terms. Some of them overlap. Some of them have some very distinct meanings. But what we really want to do with this piece is make sure that you understand all these concepts so that you can really navigate the landscape effectively and you kind of understand what all these things mean and how they come together. Next slide, please. The first of that is really just understanding, what is record clearance? In most states, there is some type of process for removing criminal records from public view. In the states that you work in now, you might hear this referred to as sealing or expungement. But as you read this guide, you will see that we kind of generally use record clearance as almost a catch-all term when we're speaking about record clearance. And also in this section, we really talk about the differences between automatic record clearance and then the petition-based process that most states currently have in place. The one thing that we really highlight is that automatic record clearance is really different from the petition-based process because under automatic record clearance, the government actually initiates this process and it clears eligible records without requiring an individual to file a petition. Similar to what David said up front, we know that the petition process is complicated, it's costly, and most people who actually initiate it never really finish out the process to the end to get relief. But on the automatic process, the government owns the process or initiates it, and it removes most of those manual complicated steps that are involved in the petition-based process. Some other areas or key terms that we highlight and provide clarity on in this section is that when we talk about automatic record clearance, there are several terms that may come up. Some of you have probably already heard them, but we really go into detail on what do we mean when we say government initiated, what are the standards that a policy must meet in order for a policy to be considered a clean slate record clearance policy. We also go into the details of this very complicated phrase of what is automatic versus automated versus automation. All those things have very clear, distinct meanings, and we really want you guys to understand what those concepts are and like how they operate in this process. Next slide, please. Right. Then the second bucket of information that's covered is really exploring how automatic record clearance actually works. In this section, we give a very detailed deep dive into the mechanics. Under this section, we explore, where are records created and who are the agencies that are responsible for managing these records. And we really provide detailed information on the processes that are set in place to make sure these records are cleared. Next slide, please. So again, the first bucket of information that we provide in this section is really from like foundation, ground up. Before we can talk about creating policies for shielding records, we probably need to know like what actually is a criminal record. So in this section, we talk about that. We talk about how these records are created and what type of data these records actually contain. Similar to what David said when he talked about technical feasibility, that data piece is very critical for us to be able to map eligibility criteria. This area also covers where criminal records are stored, where they're maintained, and who has access to them. Next slide, please. All right. And then I think probably the most critical piece of how automatic record clearance actually work is the section that we go over talking about the main steps of automatic record clearance. So we know that in order for a state to implement an automatic record clearance policy, they really need to envision a new process. The automatic record clearance will look and operate a little differently from the petition-based process, mainly because we're removing or trying to remove many of those manual steps that make the petition-based process more complicated. Under automatic record clearance, there are really three core steps that the government agencies must complete before a person can fully receive the benefit of this process. One being that the initiated agency in the state, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, they're able to identify the eligible records. Once those records are identified, that initiating agency will electronically send information about those eligible records to all the other record-keeping agencies within that state. And then once those record-keeping agencies are updated about the records that are eligible, they'll clear those records out of their system. And the real critical part in this is that they'll make sure those records are no longer accessible to the public. Next slide, please. Okay. So the guide also goes into, who are the key players that are important in this automatic record clearance process. The state agencies are very critical in making sure that these policies are implemented effectively. Some of the agencies that are involved in the process are the courts, the criminal history repositories, and law enforcement agencies. In the guide, we provide really clear details on what is their responsibility in making sure records are clear and making sure they're no longer accessible to the public. Next slide, please. All right, and I'll toss it back to David.
Great. Yeah, so the first two sections of the guide, going over that foundational knowledge and going over how automatic record clearance actually works, provide like the platform where these technical best practices actually kind of start to make sense. And so when you have that information and you have that understanding in the guide, the next and last section is about these technical best practices that we've, like I said, developed over years and years of working with different states. We have them divided into two categories. So one is about best practices on how to define those rules over which records are eligible, and then a second category based on how to structure a process so it aligns with those three core steps that Candace was talking about. The first up with the eligibility criteria, you'll be able to go into these one by one in the guide, but the overall theme is about where data is stored and how comprehensively and centralized that is. So with petition-based processes, you might have a lot of issues around a judge having to decide if someone has been rehabilitated or not, or you might have a check where somebody has to pay their fines and fees in order to be eligible. All of these different things, in order for an automatic process to function, need to have a piece of data that says yes or no on those. And the agency that has the best set of data should be the one that determines which records are eligible, but it's not going to have access to all of the different types of data that the regular petition process would have. And so the best practices in this section are about how to determine which agency has the best data and how to structure your policy that it's aligning with the types of data that they have and not requiring them to pull things from places that they can't access or might not even exist. And then the second set of best practices here are about those second and third steps that Candace mentioned about the process once that records have been determined to be eligible. So the best practices go through how to make sure that you structure that in the policy to be clear and coordinated, and making sure that it's removing redundant or unnecessary steps, and moreover, making sure that there's a clear timeline, both for a deadline for implementation to be complete, along with cadences of how often records are getting checked for eligibility and sent to different agencies, and deadlines within the process for each agency acting. Making sure the process is clear and structured is the best way to make sure that that it can actually be implemented in the real world. In the next section here, we will go over some scenarios. The first one up is, and again, sorry, I should have introed this more. We're going to go over some scenarios, and these are different use cases for how you can use the guide in your advocacy and your policy design and implementation support. So the first scenario here is using the guide to determine which agency is best suited to initiate the automatic process. So advocates in state A are in the early stages of drafting their policy, and they want to meet with agencies because they have some unanswered questions about how the process should work. But first, they need to figure out which agency is probably best suited to initiate the record clearance policy. So they're kind of stuck on this piece of which one should we approach first and ask questions about this for.
Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to be the advocate in state X. So if I was an advocate in state X, the steps that I would take in order to use the advocate guide to help me figure out which agency would be the best determining agency in my state is one, just simply reading the section that covers state agencies, learning about who are the agencies that are in the process and what are some of the responsibilities that they are in control of when it comes to automating this process or clearing those records. And then second, I will review. We actually have a best practice that's centered around identifying the initiating agency. So these best practices highlight that the agency with the most centralized and comprehensive data is usually the best choice for that state. It also gives guidance around kind of what type of court system or is your state operating out of, because they also will give you some guidance on which routes you should take in terms of selecting the initiated agency. So in most states, if you're operating in a centralized court system, more than likely the administrative office of courts will be the most ideal. But if you're in a decentralized system, then the state's criminal history repository will probably be better suited. So reviewing those best practices are kind of lean those advocates into selecting which agency will probably be best suited and will have the most necessary information in order for them to determine eligibility. Next slide.
So the second scenario is how to use the guide for making a case for amendments to a policy that's already been passed in order to improve technical feasibility. So let's say in 2020, State B passed a Clean Slate bill, but there have been challenges as the state tries to implement it. Advocates are looking into the possibility of a follow-up bill, and they want to suggest ways to improve technical feasibility to help get implementation back on course.
Next slide. So again, if I was an advocate in state B, the steps that I would take, again, we're doing a lot of education up front because we know technical feasibility is a large term and most people may not understand what it actually means. So guiding the advocates to read that section and kind of understand why it's important for policies to be technically feasible. And then two, I will just go all the way to the end of the guide and go to the page that covers the best practices. If you see this image here, if you're in the guide, we actually have a one-pager with all the best practices that cover eligibility criteria and also process criteria. So the best case that they could do to utilize the guide is actually to pull that bill out and go through each phase of it and compare it to the best practices. They can highlight the areas that they might need to change based on the best practices, or even look in their bill to see, oh, this might actually be A technical challenge, for instance, if your current bill says we're doing out-of-state checks and the agencies aren't able to do that, if you look at the best practices, it can guide you into removing that from the actual legislation. Next slide, please.
Great. And then the final scenario here is how to use the guide to explain automatic record clearance to important stakeholders. So advocates in State C are meeting with Senator Jones to discuss their Clean Slate bill. Senator Jones is a longtime supporter of record clearance legislation, and she was pretty instrumental in getting the original petition-based system set up. But she doesn't know a whole lot about automatic record clearance. So the advocates are wondering how they can explain the difference between petition-based and automatic, and then give her some education on what would need to be in the new policy and how it would be different.
Next slide, please. So we know this is probably one of the most common questions that many of our advocates get, especially in the beginning stages of trying to write a clean slate policy. So I would recommend that those advocates actually read our sections that cover automatic record clearance. We go into really good detail about, what is the process, the definition of automatic record clearance, really shifting the onus from individuals filing a petition to the government initiating the process. We go into details about the role of technology in this process and how under automatic record clearance, we really try to reduce many of those manual steps that the agencies are taking. And then probably the greatest thing is that the scalability of automatic record clearance provides relief to more people. And it makes the process way more accessible than the petition-based process. And then also to beef up the argument for the differences between automatic record clearance and the petition-based, those advocates can actually get details on, what are the core steps that are in the automatic process and how does that differ from the state's current petition-based process. Next slide. So we know that was a lot. We did a very high-level overview of some of the things that you will find in the guide. But the one thing that we really wanted to emphasize while we have you on the call is that we're looking at this as just the advocate guide as just a starting point. We will continue to support advocates in the Clean Slate initiative to make sure these policies are implemented and that they're written to be technically feasible. And so we really wanted to dive into some of the support that we can offer you guys as you go through your campaigns. So some of that support could look like if you have a bill, if you have a concept, if you have a draft, if you have an idea, we would love to see it and help you guys tailor some technical recommendations or integrate them within your policy so that we can make sure that it's feasible. Within those recommendations, we can provide tips on the eligibility criteria and also what steps your state agencies should take to make sure that they can actually implement the bill. Some of our support also looks like we love talking to state agencies that are involved in the process. Not only do we want to learn about some of their technical and data needs in the state, but we love to hear their feedback on the actual bill that we're presenting and see if there are any technical issues that may come up, given some of their technical challenges that are in the state. And then some of the other resources that we offer is if a bill is being introduced and some amendments pop up or some changes might take place, we also still can support you in identifying technical challenges, but we also want to collaborate with you and find solutions on how we can solve for some of those challenges. All right. You want to go back to the previous slide for us for a second?
There's a few more ways we can support folks during the policy campaign. Similar to reviewing proposed amendments that might come up during the legislative session, a lot of times bills will, especially when it's introduced and you start getting a hearing, there'll be feedback on the bill. This could be, hearing testimony, sometimes in a fiscal impact estimate. There'll be different ways that feedback about the bill, either from agencies or opponents in the legislature, starts bubbling up. And we can help you evaluate that feedback through a technical lens and help sort out, what is based in reality versus, what are things that we need to look into more? Where do people have a point? But we can help evaluate that external feedback through a technical lens. Similarly, we can also help you draft technical talking points. It can be really difficult to explain automatic record clearance and all the different needs. A lot of times, you'll run into legislators who are very committed to keeping the status quo, and they'll be open maybe to the idea of removing the petition process, but they want everything else to look the same. So that's one example, but there's plenty of places where it could be useful to have support in understanding how to describe these systems, how to describe what's in the policy, why it makes it more implementable, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, one of the specialized things we do in our meetings with state agencies, there's some things that just are technical by nature, involving technology, and it's not something you can really solve for necessarily with policy design and using best practices. Sometimes it really does come down to a technical issue. And so we meet with state agencies and provide demos of proofs of concept to show how they can apply technology to solve common challenges that bubble up across states.
Next slide. So we really kind of threw a whirlwind of information at you guys today, but we really wanted to leave some space for you guys to ask us questions, give us feedback or comments if you've been able to read the guide. But this really is the audience time to shine. Check the chat too.
Candace, it looks like we have a question about when this recording will be available and where it will be available. I didn't want to speak on CFA's behalf for that, but I know that CSI is planning to put the recording of this on our YouTube channel, and that'll likely be available tomorrow. But we can also send a follow-up to the attendees for this webinar and make sure that y'all get the link when it is ready.
Yes. There's a question in the chat. Has CSI spoken with anyone in government about ARC at the federal level?
Yes, we have. I can jump back in on that. So we have two federal bills right now. Well, obviously lots of change happening at the federal level, so we're monitoring that. But one is the Federal Clean Slate Act, which would create an automated process and a petition-based process for the first time for people with a subset of federal records. And then we also have the Fresh Start Act, which is about unlocking new federal funds to help state agencies with implementation costs related to clean slate legislation and automatic record clearance. So we've been in very early conversations around the implementation side of that, given we still haven't passed the bills yet, but we have started some preliminary conversations there, and happy to connect you to our federal legislative director, Reginald Darby, who oversees all of that work and can speak to that in more detail.
Okay, a few more questions coming in. Alex, I think this may go back to you, but does CSI have state-specific data available on the impact?
Yes, what a great question. Thank you. This is a perfect plug for our data dashboard. We do. Morgan, if you can find that data dashboard link and drop it in there, that'd be great. We'll also send it in a follow-up. Oh, Laura, you're on the call. Perfect. Do you want to speak to this quickly, Laura, our director of research?
Yes, thanks. Sorry. Oh, hold on. Technical issue, sorry. Our data model estimates the number of people in each state who have a record by record type and broken out by demographics. And so we use our data model to estimate the impacts of clean slate legislation in all our states. So do look at our dashboard. It's at the bottom of that link, and also read our methodology. And if you have any questions, you can always email data@cleanslateinitiative.org.
And what our team is able to do and help with, to build on what Laura was saying, is estimate based on different criteria, like this waiting period versus that waiting period, including just misdemeanors or including misdemeanors and one felony. As an example, how does that change the number of people who might benefit from Clean Slate as well as demographics? So we can help with doing those kinds of analyses.
There's one more question from Jeff. Can we see copies of draft bills? I think it'll probably be best if we could send you some copies of some bills that have passed. If you have any kind of specific questions about the legislation or best practices, you can reach out to us directly and we can support you or guide you in kind of finding answers to your questions with the bill. Bree, can you go to the next slide too so that they can see our emails as we ask questions? All right, this might go back. Let's see. Oh, Alex, can you restate who's the contact for the federal Clean
Yes, I'm gonna just put it in I'm gonna just put it in the chat.
Yeah. Another question around how have you dealt with carve-outs in winning states?
It's a good question. It's very state specific because, as many of you know, no state is the same. So we take a really kind of curated approach to that based on the guidance and advice from our state partners who know their policy context the best. Generally, in relation to this conversation on implementability, what we really try to emphasize is that in a policy compromise process, we want to really try to hold true to implementability, right? And so if a carve out means it's going to lead to an eligibility criteria that requires a whole new set of manual work because the carve out that is being asked for isn't something that's consistently tracked in a data field, we would advise our state partners to really say it's not going to make it clean slate anymore if it's going to be a ton of manual review to check for a specific kind of carve out. There are times when carve outs are something that could be automated because it corresponds to a specific data field. And in that case, it's really about the kind of political context of the state, the will and strength of the different legislative sponsors. And really, we've found a lot of success in just building a broad tent of who supports this work, who are the champions who can speak to why Clean Slate is important, and doing so in a bipartisan way, particularly in our more conservative states, but in every state, that's the kind of coalition we're trying to build. Another question from Missouri in the chat that you all might be able to speak to.
Oh, yeah, sure. We've been working in close collaboration with Empower Missouri on trying to make sure that the bill there aligns to technical feasibility best practices. And we've also had some talks with state agencies about different technical solutions that they can use to implement the bill. Those conversations are ongoing, but we've been able to demonstrate a few different technical techniques that are specific to the way court records work in Missouri. So we're hopeful that we can keep demonstrating those, and the bill, maybe this is the year.
I was trying to give it a second to see if there are any other questions that'll pop up in the chat. And if there are, please feel free to drop them in. But I also want to share that just some kind of next steps following this webinar today, similar to what Morgan stated, is that we will send out this recording. It'll also be in the Clean Slate archives, but we'll send it out once it's done downloading. We also want to send out a quick survey. We'll have some survey questions that are directly related to this presentation, but also to the guide. And then if you guys continue to have questions related to anything technical or anything that's pertaining to the guide itself, or maybe you want to know how you can incorporate those best practices to make sure that they work in your state, you can reach out to us at Code for America, and this is our email on the slide. If you're interested in bringing Clean Slate to your state, I would encourage you to reach out to the Clean Slate Initiative, and they can answer any questions that you might have there starting the campaign. And Alex has dropped her email in the chat as well. I don't see any other questions, so I might give you guys 5 minutes back. But I really want to thank you guys for joining us today and allowing us to talk more about the Advocate's Guide to Automatic Record Clearance. We are really excited for you guys to dive in and start using this in your states. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But other than that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day, people.